I think President Trump still is deluded in his thinking about our position in the international system versus Russia and the rest of the world. If we think the Russians are going to tolerate the emergence of a quote unquote Western Ukrainian government, he's very much mistaken. It's not going to happen.
Colonel Macgregor just ripped the Trump administration for failing us all in Ukraine, not only for failing to withdraw U.S. forces and resources from Ukraine, but also making foreign policy decisions that have prolonged that conflict. He gets into what those are and what the ramifications of them are. So let's check it out. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Isn't there an argument to be made that the end result is now certain? Why should another fill in the blank? You can tell me better than I can give you. Thousands Ukrainian young men die before the inevitable happens.
I think that's ongoing. Although, we've seen that 13,000 Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 25, just a little over a week ago, were suddenly released and allowed to cross the border from Ukraine into Poland, which was a rather strange development. But now we're also seeing settlements in southern Ukraine emerge, places where the population has been either denuded or is very, very thin. And we're seeing large numbers of Jews establish themselves in new communities. In fact, we have something on the internet that talks about the appearance of police around a community in southern Ukraine wearing American-like police uniforms, who are stopping anyone from going into the area who is not Jewish. And the people that wanted to go in there were Americans, but obviously they were Christians. They were halted, turned around, and sent away. We've always been hearing about this desire to create another greater Israel in parts of Ukraine, where at one point you had large numbers of Jews before the Second World War that were concentrated in places like Ukraine and part of Poland and southern Belarusia.
Yeah, actually, this isn't hyperbole. Zelensky is on the record saying he wants to make Ukraine a greater Israel, and you can read that. This isn't just a conspiracy theory that I read off the internet. That's in accordance with his own words. I haven't really followed this Ukraine story, but it is right that the young men and generations of young men are thinning in Ukraine, because over 1 million have died, probably. Some estimates go up to like 1.8 million. It's hard to know. The U.S. propaganda machine just defers to Zelensky and the tightly controlled martial law Ukrainian apparatus for all of its stats that it wants to put out there, and it's hard to tell. But what we know is this conflict has gone on way too long because the U.S. keeps bankrolling it. It wouldn't go on. There wouldn't be all these dead men if the U.S. withdrew aid like Trump should do, that he campaigned to bring peace in that war, and he's not doing what it takes.
This is very odd. Is this part of the larger plan that's bankrolled by people like Larry Fink and others to create this? Is this an extension of Israel as it is today? I have no idea. But needless to say, I thought it was very odd to find a police force that looked like they were the New Jersey State Police, and insisting that if you weren't a Jew, you couldn't go into the area. I thought that was very odd. I don't know what's going on, but clearly the numbers of Ukrainian men are at an all-time low.
Yeah, surely is. And we know that the Israel lobby actually supports U.S. aid to Ukraine. And you might be asking why? What would that benefit Netanyahu and the Israeli government? But it's because it takes eyes away from what's happening in Gaza and what's happening with the Israeli assassination of Yemeni forces a few days ago, and today Qatar forces and diplomatic forces. You know, Israel has continually bombed basically all of its neighbors since October 7th. We're not supposed to talk about that, but it's attacked Syria and Lebanon and Iran and Yemen and Qatar. And we're just supposed to bankroll it all because of this stupid entangling alliance we're wrapped up in this Israel first mentality we need to ditch and discard forever.
Let's suggest that the Ukrainian military gives up the ghost by the end of this year. Who or what do you think will run the government in the parts of Ukraine that will survive Russian acquisition.
Well, I'm sure you've listened to Orban in Hungary. He gave a speech quite recently within the last couple of days and said that behind the scenes there are talks about 3 zones. One zone in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, would be Russia. Then there would be some zone in between the Russian zone and another that is effectively a neutral zone. And then finally, in the western end of Ukraine, there would be a quote unquote Ukrainian European zone. And he was talking about whether or not this would work, but suggested that this is under discussion.
Well, spoiler, it won't work. This is just like carving up Europe and continuing to prolong a conflict between the Eastern and Western powers, the Cold War. What we have is the Cold War, and Russia's long been on record saying we won't tolerate Ukraine not being neutral. And we're talking about Ukraine in general. That's why they invaded. They couldn't accept the possibility that it wasn't going to be a buffer zone after the U.S. overthrew the Yanukovych government there in 2014. And guess what? The U.S. would behave the same way. If Russia overthrew Mexico's government and started putting military forces there, the Aegis missile systems that can launch offensive nukes, and started to militarize it completely, drilling with its units and flirting with including its power in their military alliance, the U.S. would not accept that whatsoever.
I can tell you right off the bat, if we think the Russians are going to tolerate the emergence of a quote unquote Western Ukrainian government that is open to European influence and military power, he's very much mistaken. It's not going to happen. You cross the border today into Western Ukraine and you move towards Lvov in what used to be southern Galicia, and you're going to be annihilated by Oreshniks or anything else that the Russians have that they want to use. So I don't see that happening, but I thought it was interesting that he brought that up, and I'm sure he's speaking truthfully.
Yeah, that's what this war's been about the whole time, is NATO expansion and pushing it to Russia's border. We know that from the Niet Means Niet memo that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks heroically released, where you had William Burns, who was the CIA director under Biden, but back then in 2008, I believe it was, he was the ambassador to Russia, and he told Condoleezza Rice in a memo, he said, there will be a conflict if we try to include Ukraine and Russia, and we expand NATO up to Russia's borders. I've polled all the factions within Russia, and they all disagree on many things, but on this they agree. That's what we know. That's out there. Again, not a conspiracy theory. You can find this document. But we're just supposed to pretend this doesn't exist, and it's never been about NATO. It's about Putin's desire to create a new Soviet Union or a Hitlerian empire. It's so ridiculous.
So you're still having people looking at ways to divide this child that keeps NATO's toe in the pond. That's not going to happen.
This sounds like suspiciously similar to General Kellogg's plan of a couple of months ago. I mean, we know. Here's Dmitry Peskov 2 days ago. Chris, cut number 1.
We consider it a danger for us, presence of international forces or any foreign forces or NATO country forces on the soil of Ukraine next to our borders. So in our understanding, it will not help us get closer to the solution of Ukrainian conflict.
But why doesn't Ukraine have the right, as far as Russia is concerned, to invite whoever it wants, whichever soldiers it wants, onto its territory? I mean, Russia is inviting North Korean troops.
Then it's a danger for us. It's a real danger for us because we are an enemy of NATO.
North Korean troops are a danger to Ukraine.
Written in NATO's documents. So we cannot afford that. And we'll do whatever is necessary to ensure our security.
Absolutely consistent with the public statements on the same subject matter from President Putin and from Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Well, Mr. Rosenberg, who works for the BBC, is simply an extension of the Starmer government and the Western globalist community. He's fundamentally hostile to and anti-Russian. So his question has no basis in fact. We built up this monster in Ukraine, launched it against Russia. The Russians responded. The Russians have won the war. And the Russians have said, we will not tolerate any foreign forces on the territory of Ukraine. This is why I and people like Ambassador Freeman and many others have talked, and I think John Mearsheimer have talked about the Austrian state solution. And there's
What he's talking about there is the Austrian state solution during the Cold War, and this wasn't unlike Finland and Sweden. They were neutral throughout the Cold War, and Russia didn't invade them during those times, and we have a less totalitarian government than the Soviet Union now. It doesn't take much to have that, but that's what the Russian Federation is. And there's all these, prognostications that Russia's just going to invade Poland and Ukraine tomorrow. Well, that didn't pan out when it came to the Soviet Union. There's no reason to think that will pan out now. Switzerland remained neutral during World War II. It wasn't invaded by Hitler. Neutral countries actually don't face the wrath that a lot of people project that they do, and that would be a good model to follow. And it's easy to kind of condemn Zelensky and get angry at him, and I am, because of how much he's sucking our political class into supporting his country at the expense of our country. But it was a chess piece, Ukraine was, from the perspective of the United States on a grand chessboard of empire building. And ultimately, this is the fault of my criminal government throughout multiple administrations.
no willingness in the West to accept that, because in their minds, that's defeat. And it is. It's defeat for the West, because the West set off this bomb, blew this war wide open, and now it's resulted in the destruction of effectively Ukraine as a nation state. And they're trying to recover, and so that they can effectively stand up and say, see, we didn't really lose. We have a part of Ukraine. It's not going to happen. Absolutely off the table, impossible. And again, that's one of the reasons that I think President Putin will watch carefully what happens in Paris, London, and Berlin, because as these governments collapse, eventually you're going to get new nationalist governments. So when I say nationalist, I'm talking about Germany first, France first, Britain first governments that are concerned with their populations, their welfare, and are not interested in fighting a war in a faraway territory of which they know very little and have no vested interest. But Rosenberg is a good spokesman for the globalist camp, and that's what he was doing.
Yeah, no doubt there might be, political palpitations in Europe with Starmer and Merz and Macron's approval rating being very low, Trump's approval rating right now being very low, partially because of how he's handled this and his base not being willing to accept it. Some of them are, you'll find cultists all around the Trump administration, but dissidents that actually thought he would be better in Ukraine have turned away from Trump on this issue and other issues like the Epstein cover-up, Doge, etc. But the truth is that the talk of security guarantees and Article 5 like security guarantees in Ukraine, that would be a unilateral security guarantee outside of NATO, comprised of countries that form NATO, will just not call it NATO, but have the same thing. It's not acceptable to Russia, and that's why it seems designed to tank the prospect of peace and prolong this war. Same with talking about a proxy war by having a second layer of the proxy war by first sending weapons to Europe, and then Europe sends them to Ukraine, and then they're used in the war versus Russia. That doesn't solve any kind of diplomatic peace or overtures toward Russia. That keeps us pitted against them just by another layer of proxy. That's also a disaster.
Was anything good, anything furtherance toward peace accomplished by the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska?
No, in fact, the more that you go back and reflect on it, you conclude this was another reality TV moment for President Trump. What President Trump wanted was not a meeting that would produce any tangible, concrete results, because there was obviously no preparation, study before the meeting took place. In fact, President Putin was asked just a few days ago, would you be willing to meet again with President Trump? And he said, well, of course, we've never rejected any request for a meeting. He said, however, we would prefer that the issues are carefully studied, that the team comes prepared with some proposals after reading ours and understanding our position, so that we could come out of the meeting with some sort of concrete solution or
Yeah, good. That's what should happen. But the Trump administration has talked about everything except for what's at the root cause of this war, and that's Ukraine's potential presence in NATO, demilitarization, and taking NATO resources out of Ukraine. Stop treating it like an empire building project through which is a conduit to kind of push forward American hegemony throughout the world, and denazification. That's not talked about at all. Whether the Donbass will ever go back to Ukraine or whether Crimea will ever go back to Ukraine. These are the sorts of issues that matter, not the security guarantees and the talks of, hey, we're just going to slap secondary tariffs against India, a country that could be in our fold. We could extract them away from BRICS. Nope, we're going to alienate them too. It's just so disastrous.
Or at least a step in that direction. What he's really saying is that this was an empty meeting. It didn't last but a couple of hours because there was nothing to discuss. The Russians restated their positions. And we stood there and sat motionless in front of them and assumed that the Russians would be so impressed with the fighter aircraft on the tarmac and the overflight by the B-2 that they would suddenly capitulate to whatever we wanted. I think President Trump still is deluded in his thinking about our position in the international system versus Russia and the rest of the world. I don't know how you fix that, because I don't see anybody coming to him and trying to lay out the facts. I just don't see it.
Yeah, I got to agree. The people surrounding Trump are under a track record of having pushed Trump into more conflicts, like Marco Rubio, like Mike Huckabee, like Keith Kellogg. The fact that Keith Kellogg is still in the orbit of Trump is ridiculous, considering how much he dragged neocons. The fact that he surrounds himself with Lindsey Graham, who seems to have successfully pulled him toward the neocon camp and foreign policy in every matter, including Israel and Ukraine, is preposterous, especially considering how much he dragged neocons in the 2024 campaign season, like Liz Cheney. It's just so insane. And while this goes on, while the Trump administration has funded Ukraine for 7 straight months, actually 8 straight months now almost, there are liberal Democrats who still believe that he's a pro-Putin agent operating from within the United States, that he's bankrolled Zelensky, kept this war going, not being willing to disengage, but Russiagate wasn't a hoax. That is what a lot of, establishment Democrats think. I just don't get it. There's no way you can propagandize, dissidents into believing that nonsense, but that's what a large swath of Americans believe. And I don't think there is any solution except for disengagement. Get U.S. resources and funding out of there. We'll have to see how Congress handles this. And if they send Ukraine more money, the ideas on the table now are not going to do it. I'll just say that. Whether it comes to the security guarantees or making this into a proxy war, it's not going to be acceptable for those of us that are truly non-interventionist in the Ron Paul mode, that don't want these stupid entangling alliances. We actually want to trade with Russia, maintain good relationship with Russia, a nuclear power. Same with China and India, who they're always antagonizing to. India less so, but more so lately, slapping that 50% secondary tariff on India. Trump could have been a genius champion of foreign policy by making overtures, special, unique overtures to India to peel that country away from the BRICS alliance, but instead he antagonizes Modi, who was supposedly his friend. Modi was genuinely kind and close with Trump in his first term, but just Trump turns around and slaps him in the face with these tariffs. And ultimately, the American people pay. It's a tax on foreign goods that the Americans will pay, but it doesn't make it likely that India is going to look well on that when they can just trade with other partners in their region instead. So that's where we're at. Let me know down below, is Douglas Macgregor right about this? Is Trump sabotaging the prospect of peace in Ukraine? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Andrew Napolitano too. Great podcast, great interview. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. And in return, I'll give you access to all my members only videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.